Sorry, I'm just getting over a bout of laryngitis, so I want to have the water ready at need. Let's get the presentation up here. Okay. So we're going to be talking today about, I think, some things we need to be concerned about as we move into the next generation, or evaluate, actually, the next generation of, everybody hear me? Is this good? As we evaluate the next generation of library management platforms, cloud-hosted ones that are coming onto the market now. The point of the talk is to hopefully just start a certain kind of conversation, so we are going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So we only got about 30, 35 minutes, and cloud computing is a pretty big topic. So there's a few aspects that we're actually not going to address here, including infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, privacy and security, and how incredibly useful it is in all kinds of ways. What we are going to talk about, and this is one of the few slides that I'll actually read to you, is vendor lock-in as it might apply to software as a service, library management platforms, why we should care, and what we should do about it, what we can do about it if we want to. But before I really get into the meat of the presentation here, I'd like to note that the subtitle of the presentation comes from, it's a reference to an annual survey that's done by the Gartner Group, which is a well-known firm of IT consultants, beloved by CIOs everywhere. The term peak of inflated expectations refers to the secondary phase in the software adoption hype cycle, when the initial wave of hype has not yet crested upon the rocky shores of reality. So in a sense, following this progression, we actually can answer our own question, the subtitle question right off the bat. What lies beyond the peak of inflated expectations is the trough of disillusionment. And that, at least according to Gartner, the cloud computing is well on its way there. And that's why we are beginning to see things like this cropping up in places like Forbes. So an article describing Thomas Earl's stance that cloud computing has the potential to undo many of the gains made in the last decade around interoperability and standards. And I think this observation has relevance to our own situation in libraries, as we'll see in a bit. We're also starting to see things like this, which is an article in the New York Times dated October 9th of this year, describing how cloud computing might encourage a return to a vertically integrated computing model where organizations get all of their major systems from one single vendor, and why that might not necessarily, in all cases, be a totally good thing. And we're also seeing stuff like this, which is from the blog of Carl Grant. He's currently working as an independent consultant, but he was formerly the president and chief librarian of Ex Libris North America. It's expressing a concern that some of these new systems might actually kind of lock us in ways that we're not too totally comfortable with. So you can see it's not actually just a couple of random library system types from Victoria who are concerned about this stuff. It's actually making rounds in the broader realms of IT and in the discourse around library management platforms more generally. At this point, I just want to turn things over to Corey, who will delve more deeply into the context that frames this discussion, and then I'll come back in a bit.
Thanks, John, and I'm glad you're here. When your co-presenter has laryngitis the day before the presentation, you start to panic. Would have had to talk to an empty chair, and we all know how that goes. So.
I would have sat here.
Okay, so good morning. What are we talking about when we're talking about these new systems, the library management platforms? Specifically, we're talking about systems that combine a range of library applications that are currently separate. like the ILS and the ERMS and a bunch of other stuff, hosted in a remote data center with multiple customers. That's the multi-tenancy. Hosting the same instance of the software, and the subscription model for pricing is important too, and we'll come back to that. So we'd like you to note the lack of examples here. It's not our intention to single out any particular vendor or system today. We can do that at the bar later tonight. But so we're talking in broad strokes here about big issues in the marketplace, generally speaking, the automation marketplace, and we're talking about general trends that we think should give us pause and that we need to think a bit more about. We think. And note the lack of the word cloud in this slide, although we use it ourselves throughout the presentation. It's really just a buzzword. Vendor managed is probably the better way to describe it, because for us, control is the real issue here, not where the stuff actually lives. Library management platforms have a number of advantages and selling points, obviously. And these are some of the ones that you'll encounter the most often. I think it's important to disentangle these threads in the discussion, however. The first two have the potential to really benefit our organizations, but they also have the least to do with the cloud or software as a service. It's primarily the last two that we're focusing on here because those most clearly raise the specter of lock-in, and we're going to get to lock-in in a minute. We would like to stress that these new systems have a lot to offer. What's troubling for us is that their positive features are coupled with some potentially not so positive features, and it's that happy side of things that we'd like to dwell on today. That black box there. And although there's much about these systems that is new, obviously, there are some curious parallels with a previous generation of library automation. The generation of 30 years ago, that was when the original integrated library systems began to be developed. I was 10. And a bunch of discrete operations like circulation, acquisition, serials management, and eventually the OPAC were combined into a unified one-stop shop for all your library technology needs, aka the integrated library system. And at this point, I think we all know how that went. The ILS never really succeeded as a one-stop shop, and less these days because the ILS development has basically stagnated for over a decade. All the interesting stuff of the last few years, from link resolvers to ERMs systems to discovery services, happened outside the framework of the traditional ILS. Why was that? I asked myself. The answer, we think, has more than a little to do with the economics of lock-in. So what is lock-in exactly? Switching costs and lock-in have been extensively studied in the economics literature at least since the 80s. In 1998, Shapiro and Varian, they are a couple of Berkeley economists, wrote a book called Information Rules, and that's where this quote is from here. The subtitle being A Strategic Guide to the Networked Economy. And they were very explicit about the economic benefits that can result to vendors from being able to lock in customers. The essence of lock-in is that your choices in the future are effectively limited by your investments today. These linkages differ between commodities and systems, but they are ubiquitous when it comes to information systems. So you can park a Chevy in your garage, even if you've owned a Toyota for 20 years, but if you switch from Windows to Ubuntu, for instance, you can't just park all your old information in that same in the garage. You'll have to deal with different document formats, application software, and perhaps most importantly, you'll have to invest a bunch of time and effort in learning the new operating system. And I should mention here that there are different ways that lock-in can happen. These are discrete little bullet points up on the screen, but obviously there's lots of overlaps in the real world. But for example, data can be stored in proprietary data structures or file formats that cannot easily be imported or moved between systems. especially if those systems are competing in the marketplace. Software can be constructed so as to only interoperate with other software from the same vendor. If you do a lot of development against proprietary APIs, which I know a lot of you do, you might have to throw out or rewrite a lot of your code when those APIs change. And of course, when the day-to-day operations of your organization are deeply intertwined with the workflow management tools from a particular vendor, the disruption to your staff that would be incurred by switching can be simply too much to complicate. I'm sure we've all had night terrors based around that type of thing. Now, in the abstract, lock-in occurs over 2 periods, and this is an abstract economic model. When it comes to the new generation of library management systems, we're in the first period, I would argue. And when it comes to the ILS, we're in period number 2 here. In the first period, and again, these are abstract concepts, the vendors are attempting to establish market share in order to gain the real profits, which don't actually come until later. This is when you get price wars and sweet deals, and in the second period, when you're actually locked into the system, the vendor has a de facto monopoly, and they can extract, although they don't always, monopoly prices. And even a low price from a competitor won't be able to entice you away at this point because your switching costs are just simply too high. Your library is tied into the current systems, workflows, procedures, data, APIs, the website, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this graph is familiar to a lot of you. It's the rise in the cost of serials expenditures. And even though journal articles are obviously a different beast altogether, new library management systems or management platforms generally use a subscription model. And when a vendor or publisher or content provider is confident that you have to continue to subscribe, whether the lock-in is a result of content lock-in from must-have journals or systems lock-in, the results tend to be the same. And this is what we should at least reasonably expect a second period chart to look like for any subscription product. The subscription products, obviously, that's the steep line going up there. This is from 1986 to 1999, but it just kind of kept going. Books, which you buy outright and manage yourself, they have a different line, and indeed that's more along the center there. I don't want to take this analogy too far, but I thought this was an interesting way to kind of think about it. But when we were thinking about it, and very deeply, it's about more than just money. It's also about innovation and the relationship between innovation and lock-in. So in the second period, subscription fees rise and customers are locked in, and customers won't entertain a competing system from even if it has superior functionality, because at this point all of your eggs are in one basket, and the switching costs are simply too high for you to move over. From the vendor's perspective, with locked-in customers paying yearly subscriptions who likely won't switch to a competing product, even if that product is superior, the incentive for innovation, at least arguably, is dampened. Inferior products or systems or designs, in the case of the QWERTY keyboard, can persist over time even in the face of superior products. And lock-in perhaps goes a long way to explain why we still use the QWERTY keyboard, which was patented in 1878 to prevent the mechanical jamming of keyboards, even though arguably there are superior layouts that would improve typing speed and productivity, which I will never use. Clarify. This is also something I will never use, although I desperately wanted one as a child. I was of that age, and a calculator watch at the same time. Lock-in limits choice, making libraries less agile, less able to respond to the changing needs of clientele. Perhaps lock-in and the economic models and incentive structures that go along with it go a long way to explain why the ILS as we know it persisted for so long. At the start of the 1980s, as libraries of all sizes were starting to automate in a serious way, circulation systems were the first systems most libraries had, the first automated systems. When they went to get an acquisition system, if they wanted the data to move meaningfully between the two, they were often forced to rely on the acquisition system built by the same vendor that built the circulation system. and so on and so on and so on until the the truly integrated library system came along a few years later. So as the market for the ILS saturated, as customers became locked in and the incentives to develop new and better products lessened, and as more and more profits came from maintenance fees, the ILS kind of froze. Electronic journals came along, better and better discovery tools came along, but the ILS really didn't in many ways. Google happened, that was 1998. Electronic text happened, obviously a lot earlier than that, but in a really big way during this time. The world changed, and arguably our systems really didn't keep up with those changes. And now our sense of urgency is capital for vendors who promise to solve the same problems we're going to potentially have again down the road if we lock into single large systems from single vendors. But there is hope, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to John. Thank you.
I'm not usually the voice of hope, actually, but we'll see. If we just find the right page in my notes here, because I'm really bad at extemporizing. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to, be concerned about lock-in and its implications for the library automation marketplace going forward. What are some of the things we can do? What are some of the stances or approaches we could take? And I'm probably, preaching to the choir here. But one of the big marketing pitches for the new software as a service systems is that, how much time and money you will save on technology if you adopt software as a service, right? The subtext here seems to be that it's somehow really, really hard to manage technology and really expensive, and that technology isn't really a core part of our business, so we should be happy to just kind of shuffle it off. And one of the cases in point is the quote on this slide, which was offered by a library as one of the major strategic reasons they had for wanting to migrate to a vendor-hosted system. And I kind of wonder how many other library administrators sort of feel that way, because it seems to me that there's really no way to manage information without also managing technology. I mean, it's sort of like wanting to fly somewhere but not wanting to take a plane. They're just kind of inextricably linked. And I don't think this means you have to run a data center, but I do think what it does mean is you have to be able to make intelligent decisions about your technology, think strategically about it, think how you want your technology to move in the years down the line, and decide about who runs it, how it runs, what kind of access you need to it, and so on. I don't think you're going to be well positioned to make those decisions if you don't actually consider managing technology to be part of your job. So, if technology is something that we, are at least, should be willing to think about, maybe we should take a second look at our current systems just to see if there are any, good things about them here that we maybe don't want to lose as we move forward. This is a highly simplified schematic of where many of us are with our current technology environments. And to hear some folks tell it, this is really, really bad, right? This is terrible. There's all these disparate systems. Oh my gosh, they're just killing us. We have to schlep all this metadata back and forth between them. Oh goodness. Actually, personally, I don't think it's all that bad, right? I mean, it's all kind of working. Things are moving along. And it's not to say this couldn't be improved, and probably improved a lot, but it's okay, right? There's no tearing urgency for us to abandon this just yet. Personally, I think a degree of complexity is kind of unavoidable. If we're, given all the things that we're trying to do and all the systems out there that we're, planning to interoperate with. And more importantly, there are some real advantages to this way of doing business, right? Like the ability to swap out components without having to scrap the whole system every time, right? And choose best-of-breed software from a variety of vendors rather than getting all your solutions from just one. So, for example, at UVic, we get all this stuff from 5 different vendors, right? And the components, they're pretty loosely coupled. They're using standards like, open URLs, Z3950, schlepping MARC records back and forth, all the usual suspects. And, last year we swapped out our link resolver and our ARMS, and basically nobody noticed except the people whose job it was to actually make those things run. And that's kind of the environment I want to hold on to, right? One where we can evolve our systems to meet our changing requirements and not just have to, scrap everything and start over again. But wait, I'm finessing that one a little bit. Things aren't actually quite as disaggregated at UVic as I'm leading you to believe. When we swapped out our link resolver and our ERMS, in fact, what we did was to move them to a vendor-hosted software as a service, multi-tenant type platform. And we did it because we were running our discovery service on one platform with one vendor, and our ERMS and link resolver with another vendor, and the two didn't really interoperate at all under the hood, right? So basically, at our serials department, we're having to update two knowledge bases, trying to keep them in sync. It was operationally inefficient and just kind of bad systems design. So, hey, we moved them all to the same vendor that runs our discovery service. So we gained some efficiency, but in the process, we lost some really necessary flexibility. Because now, if we ever decide we want to, try a different discovery service, we can't just swap out our discovery service for a new one, right? We now have to consider the organizational impact of swapping out all three of those components. And in fact, there's actually 4 components because that black arrow between the ERMS and the ILS is another service that we pay for. I mean, I think that's kind of too bad in a way. And again, it's concerning because why should our backroom staff workflow management systems be that tightly coupled to one of our major public service delivery points? What's the advantage there? That seems to be, in fact, a real step backwards, to the days when your web OPAC was what you had because, you bought your circulation system from your vendor 20 years ago. So while I'm happy to report that we currently like our discovery service just fine, and we like our ERMS and our link resolver, I'm not trying to, say bad things about our vendor, but I'm just not sure that if one comes along that we don't like better, that we wouldn't just stick with the one we already have anyways. And that, to me, is kind of the definition and the concerning aspect of lock-in. So what I want, of course, is a standard that lets me decouple my ERMS from my discovery service, right? Kind of like the standard that lets me decouple my ILS from my discovery service. Developing a similar ERMS standard for metadata exchange wouldn't be an insurmountable problem, but oddly, no one seems to be putting a whole lot of work into developing one right now. Excuse me. I think even more importantly, such a standard would be critical for ensuring our ability to migrate between library management platforms in the future. When you ask vendors about your ability to migrate your data between systems, if you ever cancel your subscription, they'll say, no problem. We'll give you a full dump of your MARC records when you leave. The problem, of course, is that rebuilding your ERM from a set of MARC records is not something you can actually do, right? It's going to be a huge manual effort to get all that data repopulated in somebody else's system. And even a full ERM export isn't very useful due to internal differences in how the data is stored and which data elements are available. Unfortunately, the group that should be working on this standard hasn't quite got to it yet. But I'm hoping they will get to it eventually because I think to get a sense of why this is important, I invite you to envision the ILS marketplace if a standard for metadata exchange between ILS systems didn't exist. So this really kind of highlights, leads up to something that's extremely important with these systems, with any system really, is to have an exit strategy, right? When you're evaluating any system that you're about to purchase, obviously you want to know how much it's going to cost to extricate your organization from it when you leave. And all systems come with switching costs, every single one, but some more than others. And you need to take them into account during the initial evaluation phase, right? Not when it's too late and you're already locked in and the only way you can get out is to put in a bunch of money or time or both. Some folks might imply, of course, that switching costs are the cost of your next system, right? If you never switch, you'll never incur them. But the reality, they should be considered as part of the system you're buying right now because ultimately they're just simply deferred costs that you're pretty sure you're going to incur at some point down the line since just about nobody stays with the same system forever. So how are you going to switch from one library management platform to another? Bring everything back in-house if this whole cloud thing turns out to be a flash in the pan. How much work will be involved, right? And, the interesting, I don't think anybody has a clue at this point beyond, a whole heck of a lot. I think that alone should make us a little bit cautious about going down this road. Of course, even if you could get your data out in some usable format at the end of your subscription, that's of course not the only time you're going to want access to it. You're still going to need to interoperate with all sorts of external applications, particularly if, like us, you're part of a university. You'll need to integrate your software with the campus identity management system, web portal, course management system, and so on. It's kind of funny, actually. On the one hand, we're told that the internal components of these systems will never work well together if we have to rely on standards and APIs, right? That's a line I hear a lot. And yet, when you ask about interoperability with other systems, we're told that, well, there's no problem because you can just use APIs. And as you know, sometimes APIs can be really, really useful, but they have their limitations. And sooner or later, you come up against a wall, and everybody who's worked with them knows this, where you want to get at some set of data elements that just isn't exposed by the API, or maybe you've got access to a great API and you build some fabulous services around it, and then the vendor kind of changes it in ways that make it less useful, or they just deprecate it altogether. So, ultimately, this is why you need direct, unmediated access to your data at some level, right? You need to be able to get at the core of your systems. Otherwise, your data is locked in, and you're locked out. To continue with our theme of learning from the past, I could sort of bring in Z39.50 in this context, but at least it was a standardized API. A lot of the new ones aren't. Interesting to me that there was a time not that long ago, and I remember from previous Access conferences, people talking about the disintegrated library system, right? The Holy Grail. And the consensus vision for a number of players anyways was that the next ILS would be more along the lines of what we're talking about here, a sort of distributed, horizontally integrated system. 5 years ago, Computers in Libraries, again, surveyed some heavy hitters in the library technology space to see what they wanted the next generation ILS to look like. The 4 points in the slide were derived from John Bleiberg, Roy Tennant, Kristen Antleman, Ross Singer, Andrew Pace, and Stephen Abram. And while there were some differences among the respondents, there was a high degree of consensus around where the ILS should go in the future, right? It should be open, extensible, modular, and standards-based, reflecting, I believe, a wisdom derived from hard-fought years of fighting with intractable systems that never really lived up to their early promise of delivering a one-stop shop for library technology. Yet, the new library management platforms have basically none of these qualities, right? So what happened? How did standardized workflows or streamlined workflows, rather, and ease of operation come to supersede openness and agility in our hierarchy of values? Did we just get lazy or what? So, instead of modularity, the new systems are going in the opposite direction, which is like one big package deal. It's way more tidy, I'll grant you that. But look at what we're about to lose, which is a huge amount of flexibility. If you go down this road, you're going to hand over your technological future to one vendor, and they'll get to decide what your options are. There's a cost here, right? It's hard to quantify, but it's real, and it will likely have negative implications for our organizations going forward. Somehow I can't believe, too, that a unified system, a unified solution will replace all of those individual components equally well, right? Each of these systems is likely to have certain strengths in core areas and then weaknesses in others. And none of our current suite of applications is even close to perfect, so, given it's the same vendors developing the new ones, why would we believe that they will get everything right this time around? There's always going to be gaps and areas of things you want to do better. Give the example of our current ILS where it has a media booking module, but we don't use it. We built our own because the built-in one was not very good. It has a course reserves module. We just bought a new course reserve management system, and so on, right? Anything that makes us less agile needs to be approached with a high degree of caution, because while these systems may meet our needs very, very well right now, there's no guarantee they're going to continue to meet our needs 5 or 10 years down the line, right? We only have to look at the way the development of the ILS played out after the market was saturated to get a sense of what the future might be like here. So once your vendor has you locked in, what economic incentives do they have to continue to expend resources to developing these systems, right? Given the switching costs, you'd kind of have to hate your system a lot before you'd ever change. So all I really need to do is to continue to make small incremental improvements to the system. And if there was any major functionality to be added, well, there'd be this optional module that you could buy, but you can only get it from the one vendor because no one else interoperates with your system. So we're not saying all this bad stuff is what will happen, right? But what we're saying is that it could if we're not careful. Lock-in is a powerful factor in the software industry, including our own little corner of it. So when your switching costs go up, your agility goes down. I don't think all of us should be too quick to leap on the software as a service bandwagon, right? Some organizations, it probably makes a lot of sense. You're not going to lose much anyways. But the reality is, for those of us with IT resources, this might not be the best road to go down right now. And in the end, of course, we may discover that there are, in fact, alternative approaches that we like better. So here we are, cresting the peak of inflated expectations and sliding inexorably into the trough of disillusionment. But not wanting to end on a down note, I should point out that beyond the trough of disillusionment lies the fabled slope of enlightenment, that phase in the cycle when both the hype and the counter-hype fall off, and we get truly get a sense of what the new technologies are for and what they can offer us and how best to apply them in practice. I think that's something to look forward to. So, I think we have some time for questions here.
If you could really throw your hands up in the air and wave them like you just don't care if you have questions so that I can see you. And Laura's helping me out, so. You got it.
I'm not entirely sure what my question is. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything. The museum world is already there. I guess I've been taking notes, and the thing that I'm wondering about is, are you talking about archiving functionality of a system? Because that's very different from the data. I can get all the raw data from the database that we use, and I mean, it was software from the 90s, so it was built along the technological constraints of the time, which means it's laid out the way the census tables are, which means it's impenetrable gibberish unto itself. I mean, it's not terrible. I mean, it's great, but I guess when we're talking about all of this, there is access to your data, all for it. But then there's also that whole question of the user interface, the whole question of how the data is manipulated, how people actually use it. When I did a talk about parallel flicker at the beginning of the year, and one of the things I said was, we made a point of letting people back up their data, all of it. We were never worried that people were going to compete on the interface. At the same time, no one ever did because they trusted us fantastically. So there's a couple things. One is people have a responsibility to back their stuff up. Right? I mean, if we had to do it again, I would have pushed for a blessed backup client. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, where the actual functionality of the software fits into all of this. Is it just data?
No, I think I think we're probably talking about two sort of different worlds of data in a sense. There are some fairly strong library standards. Well, fairly strong library standards around data interchange between systems. There's also a fairly high degree of the system's been around for a long time, so at least at a certain level, we kind of know the stuff that they need to do. And there are a number of competing systems that essentially do the same things out there. And many of them are provided by vendors. There's some open source systems as well, and so on. So I think the functionality is available if your data can be ingested in ways that are recognized and standard, right? Like I can take, one of the things we do right now is we export data from our library, our legacy library catalog, which has been around forever, into our discovery service. And we do that daily with just batch updates using a standard called MARC to basically transmit the data from one system to another. Since everybody knows what MARC is, and we know, I mean, it's complicated, but it's standard, right? It's available. we can make those systems interoperate simply by exchanging data between them and setting up rules for how to ingest the data in particular ways. I think at some level, our data structures are much simpler than what you're talking about with the extremely complex data that you can't make sense of without an entire system to do it for you. I don't think it's that hard to set up standards around the exchange of data that allow systems to be designed around them in this space. It probably is in other spaces, but this we could do.
So we have a SASE ILS, and I really hate it. I'll just start with that. And I had nothing to do with the decision. It was made before I showed up where I work. It's hateful for all the reasons you've laid out here. And it's also the silliness of doing things like paying for an API to your own data, paying thousands of dollars for an SSL certificate, because they're so expensive and they come gold-plated and so forth, is a daily reminder of just how fatefully bad that decision was. One of the impacts, though, that I don't think you touched on, or maybe I just sort of overlooked it, was the staff productivity. Every time the vendor botches something, and vendors botch things at a rate that is similar to the rate that we would botch things, which is occasionally, the staff productivity loss time when that happens is enormous. And I don't think it's a cost that we really calculate sometimes when we talk about these things, but if we were being businesslike, we would see the thousands of dollars of lost productivity every single time they do something stupid on their end.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't know, do you have anything you wanted to say about that? Because I've got one or two observations. One of which is that we didn't actually talk to the point of workflow improvements, right? I mean, this is one of the major selling features of the new library management platforms, and I think there's some truth there. If your staff are working within one system, the system is built so that the different components of it, interoperate at an extremely tight level. Assuming the system works, right, which they don't always, but assuming that it works, you actually could stand to gain some serious staff workflow improvements. We certainly saw that when we integrated our discovery layer and our ERMS. I mean, that's a primary area for integration for us, and there's no question the stat we gained in doing so. So I guess, part of the talk here is really about how much is that worth to us based on versus the flexibility that you would lose by tightly coupling everything to the point where you're really basically just sort of stuck with that one system. It's not a question that I think has a universal answer, right? I think it will depend on your context and your situation and so on. But at this point anyways, I'm not convinced necessarily that we're so inefficient that we need to just glom the ILS and the ERMS into one giant system, right? And I think that we need to have that conversation.
Just mention something. Okay. One of the things we're doing at UVic is a workflow analysis around all of the processes that could potentially be captured by these new tools, just to fully understand. And actually, when you go back in the literature, when automation first started, there was a lot of workflow analysis going on. And I think that act will be good in and of itself, but you raise a good point.
So I think you just largely addressed the thing that I was going to ask about, but I'm curious because a lot of the conversation we have about this movement in the library world is about finding efficiencies and lowering the cost of staff management of various knowledge bases and consolidating for those reasons. So there's a lot of talk about that cost, and I'm wondering if in your decision making at UVic, if the costs that you're talking about this morning were a big part of that conversation as well, or if it really did focus around the dollar cost of managing multiple knowledge bases with staff. Nobody really thinks that closely about systems cost. I mean, increasingly at UVic, we're actually kind of blessed with a really great university systems department. So things like hosting costs and managing all sorts of different pieces of technology actually aren't that big a deal for us. We've got a good data center, reasonable rates for putting servers in it and so on.
So we aren't going to see a lot of cost savings around the hardware piece. In fact, I had a whole section of the presentation that I just cut because it's just too focused on our own particular situation. So it really was more of the staff workflow, the cost associated with the staff workflow in our serials unit that was one of the big drivers for that decision. It was great, actually, nice that we didn't have to replace a server that was running in our data center. That was a nice little feature. We were a short implementation window, so it was great not to have to do that. But in retrospect, I'm not sure that we gained a huge amount from that. What it did make me aware of was that it's very, very easy to move into a software as a service solution, but I'm seeing reasons now why it will be much more difficult to move out of that space should we ever want to, and I assume we will want to at some point. So that's, yeah. Did I answer your question?
Well, I'm wondering if that was part of the conversation, like if in making those decisions, if you were considering the cost of exit at that time, if the cost of lock-in was a serious concern that was brought up when you were doing that, or if it was really the staff workflow and those issues that drove that decision.
It was the staff workflow and those issues, yeah. The lock-in piece was actually the sort of growing awareness of it kind of happened after we moved into the system, and I began to see that there was a whole bunch of things we did migrating from some locally hosted systems into the cloud that were one-way solutions that couldn't work the other way around. I mean, just simple things like redirecting links from our old link resolver to the new one, so we didn't have to update the links to the link resolver in 600 different databases on the same day, kind of thing. Right? We lost that ability in our hosted environment. Some hosted environments you might not, but it's something to be aware of when you're going in. And then other things around moving the data from our old ERM into the new one. It didn't really become apparent to us until we were into the process how not possible it was to just take the holdings data from our old ERM and dump it into the new one. It was essentially a manual rebuild of the ERM. So a certain amount of this talk just comes out of what happened after that migration and some realizations that we had.
We have time for one more quick question, if there's anybody. No? All right, well, let's give a big hand to John and Corey. Awesome.